Thank you, Beth. I am really excited to be here as well, and it's great to work with Beth. We met each other the first time when she also was with the Mackinac State Historic Park, so we've had kind of this long relationship, both of us growing in our professional lives and personal lives. But as Beth mentioned, I'm now working for the Mackinac State Historic Parks. I've been with them by and large since 2007. And over that period of time, I've had a lot of different jobs there. Right now, I am working as the interpretive assistant for the parks. So within the Mackinac State Historic Parks, I'm sure you all know, we have a historic lighthouse, we have a historic mill that we take care of, and then we have colonial Michilimackinac and Mackinac City, which is where I usually work, but also a few sites on Mackinac Island. So we have a lot that we're looking at. And I've had the pleasure of working at many of those places. But we today are going to be focusing on my experience gardening at Michilimackinac. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the research, the sources that I'm looking at, how we put those into play, and what sorts of things I've learned from that. And I do also want to say that I am not a master gardener. I grew up gardening, and most of what I know about gardening comes from practical experience, from lots of reading, asking other local folks. You very well could be of help. Gardeners have to talk with one another to see what works and what doesn't in the locations that we're at. So that's going to be sort of the outline of our program. We'll be talking about the history and a little bit about how we put that into play at Colonial Michilimackinac. So to get started, I just want to talk a little bit about what Michilimackinac was. The Straits of Mackinac and northern Michigan, of course, were home for thousands of years to people. They were specifically gathering at the Straits at that point in Mackinac City to fish. There were a lot of people coming there for diplomatic reasons. They were coming for religious reasons. And they were also coming to trade. With the waterways as the highways, Mackinac made a very natural place for folks to gather. Jesuits came into the area, explorers came into the area, and the military did as well. There were some soldiers, of course, in St. Ignace, and then in 1715, they went away. And then in 1715, the first fort was established where we know it now. It was first a French fort, and then it became a British fort in 1761. Those French people stayed, as did the indigenous people. They were here throughout this whole time period. And our population estimates, which I think that's important, I need to know what that looks like. By the 1770s, we've estimated maybe 200 people lived there year round, and that does include the military presence. So some civilians, some soldiers. In the summertime, though, it would grow to maybe 2,000. So when we're thinking about gardening and growing things and what those gardens could provide for people, thinking about that population of 2,000 people in the summer, that's a lot of folks to feed. So how are they dealing with that in the period? So we look at all those things. We've got a lot of sources that are available to us to help round out that picture as well. So some of the things that we look at, and sorry, some of my photos are going to be blurry, but the first things we look at are oral histories. We've got great information that the Ojawa here share with us. We've got information from other Native nations that helps tell us about what the culture was like around gardening before it was being written down. We've got loads of documents. We always want more, but maps that you'll see throughout this program that were drawn in the period, those primary sources. We've got journals from people like John Askin, Jonathan Carver, all these folks traveling through the area, the military records. We have a lot of documents that we can look at. Even the church records sometimes can be useful. And we also have a really special archaeology program. If you've been to Michilimackinac before, in June, July, and August, there are archaeologists out there every day excavating. And I love it because when they find things, they will often say, hey, come over here and look at this. And I might be the second or third person to see that particular artifact in over 200 years. So it's a really special program. And we do find faunal remains, lots of bones and lots of fish scales, but we also find plant material. Our soil is really sandy. If you're a local gardener, you probably know that. We've got sand. And that environment allows a lot of things that maybe wouldn't necessarily survive to survive at Michilimackinac. I know that we've identified various brassica seeds. Those could be radishes, they could be cabbages, even things like arugula, all those sorts of family plants. We've found squash seeds, bean seeds, pin cherries, peas, watermelon seeds, quite a wide variety. Some of those had been charred, and that's what preserved them. But when the archaeologists are digging, what's happening is they're piecing together all these layers and again helping us to form a full picture of what the site was like in the 18th century. The top layer, we've got the modern layer. Then under that, there's a demolition layer. So that's what was happening in 1779 to 81 when they were taking the fort apart. Then below that, we have the British layer, British occupation, French occupation, and then, of course, the pre-contact. So the archaeology, as well as all of these other sources, are really valuable to us. But we also, talking about sources, we have some early descriptions that tell us what the landscape looked like. This kind of lengthy quote from the Jesuit Relations has absolutely been my favorite one to share with visitors because, as today proves, it's quite windy here, and it was windy then as well. He says, first the winds. He goes on to talk about how it's as if the Great Lakes are incessantly playing ball with one another, which I love that description. So true and so well written. I don't think I could ever do any better. So when we're thinking about the challenges that early folks living at the Straits of Mackinac had, you know, just living may have been difficult, but if you think about living and also trying to be self-sufficient, good gracious, if you're dealing with this wind, with this drifting sand, what would that have been like? But this map here is one of the early maps, and I will mention that it has the names of the owners written on it. You can see that. And then in the back of each of these houses, there's a little fenced off yard. We don't know exactly what people were doing with those yards, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but some of them are very specifically labeled as gardens. So I've got a couple more of the early descriptions that I'll talk about in a minute, but the types of gardens that we're seeing in these descriptions, I kind of break it down into groups of people. It's just like today, a person, you know, from Florida is going to garden different than a person in Michigan. So we know that in Odawa and Ojibwe communities, especially, gardening was very much just like is now a seasonal occupation. They were semi-nomadic, so they're moving from one place to another based on what the resources were. And especially in Native communities, gardening was something that was done by women. And we'll talk about that again in a second. But they had fields in various locations in the area. Again, not really at Michilimackinac because it's so super windy and so sandy, but we know that they have gardens that they are working. When the French come in, their focus really at the Straits was for trade. We know they had some fields based on some of the maps and descriptions, but they're really not doing a ton. The Jesuits also maintained a little bit of agricultural work, but it's never self-sufficient during that French period. The British also are never self-sufficient. With the waterways, it was so easy to bring things. And it might seem kind of counterintuitive. Why bring things? Why go through the expense of growing peas in Europe to ship them over to Michilimackinac? But if you think about the labor and the quantities that were needed, the 18th century people in Europe already had that system in place. In North America, we're still starting to get going. So especially during the French and the British period, most things were getting shipped in. Whatever they could ship in, they were shipping in. So thinking about how the economics of those different times worked sometimes is really important and helps me understand why people are growing what they're growing or not growing what they're growing. But getting back a little bit more to the native influence on gardening and growing things, we talk about the fur trade a lot at Michilimackinac. So it's an import-export business. All the people that are importing and exporting merchandise and furs, they have to have fuel. So they rely very heavily on the corn that is being grown by native people. These were just at the bottom of this slide. I just pulled out 2 snippets about corn from a merchant. I mentioned him earlier, John Askin. He is really curious. He was the wealthiest fur trader that we have living at Michilimackinac. He is buying corn all the way in Milwaukee because he wasn't able to source it closer for a good price. So he's sending boats to Milwaukee to buy corn, and then he's feeding his staff that corn. He does have a farm. Now it's near what we call French Farm Lake. It was in that area. It's about 3 miles away from Michilimackinac, and he does plant corn there. So when we talk about that cross-cultural influence, we see European people or John Askin, who was coming here, starting to grow some of the things that they were seeing successful in the area. So doing that bit of adaptation to grow what worked, which is always important. So the native people, they are really the ones that are doing the bulk of the, I guess, mass produced food in Michigan and in this region. So when we get into the French period, this is also quite a long clip, but the fella that wrote this first quote, Lotbiniere, he was a pretty young engineer when he came to Michilimackinac, and his job while he was here was to describe what it looked like. He again talks about sand, just like we heard earlier, lots of sand. He talks about it being barren. There's one instance where he's describing in another place that it was kind of wasteland-like, so not very promising for growing things. But he also says that they're farmers. Like the people here, they knew how to grow things, they just chose not to. And thinking of that as an option is also really interesting. Sometimes we also look at other places similar to Michilimackinac. So we know from a traveler named Calm, he was in Canada, a little bit down into the colonies as well. We know that there were certain things that were being grown in certain places. And in Canada, he mentions a lot of apple trees, and he mentions a lot of the vegetables. He's very descriptive of the plants that are being grown. So I really like looking at these original sources and seeing what their perspective is, but also learning about the person. So Lotbiniere was only 22 when he came to Michilimackinac and had opinions. So it's good to recognize that. But during the British period, we start to see more expansion. And at Michilimackinac today, we interpret the British period. So that's what we're presenting to the public. So these are the things that are most relevant to me. Our friend Peter Pond could not spell, so it can be a challenge sometimes to read through his writings, but he again describes Michilimackinac as sandy. But by the British period, we start to see people bringing in manure, and that word manure can mean different things. It could mean vegetable compost. Sometimes in the period they call it vegetable manure, or it could have been actually animal manure. We're not quite sure. But in any case, they're amending the soil. They're starting to use more of those techniques to get things to grow. We also see a couple of other people talking about what they could grow here, what they couldn't grow, but they almost always mention that it's not a great place to grow things. So we have these sources available to us. And I also do like to look slightly forward. You can get in a lot of trouble doing that, but there were a couple of people that lived at Michilimackinac in the 1770s, and then they moved to Mackinac Island when Michilimackinac was destroyed. One of those people was Mrs. Mitchell, and a description of her was written a number of years after she was visited with, but she had what sounds like a pretty extensive garden on Mackinac Island. She grew lots of vegetables. Many of the things that she was growing would have been what we typically think of today as garden vegetables, things like root vegetables and greens. But she herself was not she was not French. She was not British. She was part French, but she's coming from a different background, and it's interesting to see what she's growing in her garden and how she's managing it and how she's giving orders. So I like this description of her, but we know she is gardening at Michilimackinac as well. So we look at these sorts of things. So when we're putting all these sources together, I've got quite a lot of research to build on. I started working with the gardens in 2011. And at that point, they'd sort of been left for a while. There had been a researcher and a staff person working for the Mackinac State Historic Parks for quite a long time named Sally Eustace. If anyone is familiar with her book, it's called History from the Hearth. She put together a lot of information. And so I'm able to build on some of that. And some of the plants that she planted at the fort are still going strong. She unfortunately passed a couple of years ago, but what she did has been really helpful to us. We have her research that we can look at, and history practices change over time. So some of the things that she was seeing, we now see differently. But we're still dealing with lots of limitations, just as all the people in the past were. Our soil is still awful. We bring in truckloads of manure every year, but it's still awful. We don't have a watering system aside from Mother Nature. We do have some hoses, but we have to drag them out. And if you've ever been to Michilimackinac, it's a lot of hose to drag. We have a small staff. It's quite often myself and just a handful of other people that are taking care of over 5,000 square feet of gardens, which is what we have right now. Of course, money can be a problem. We do a lot of things to save money in the garden, and we'll talk about those because pro tips, right? And then we also have lots of visitors that come to see us. So what we want to do with our gardens is to take all of the information that we have. We want to present the fort in the way that it was in the period, but we also focus very, very much on sharing all that with our visitors. So it doesn't matter if I found the perfect plant for the perfect spot if I have no one to share it with. So our tourists are both our challenge, our limitation, but also the reason that we're here. So it's really important when we're planning things to keep them in mind. There are places in the fort where we have changed things because we have visitors coming, which we're here for them, so that's what we're going to do. But historically, gardens would have had fences around them. Visitors can't see if there's a fence. So we have our limitations. So again, I do like to come at it with a practical approach. I don't only rely on rain. I like I mentioned, pull-out hoses sometimes. We try to keep the modern methods in mind. We now understand more about the chemical makeup of the soil, and we can get our soil tested and know what we need to add specifically. There are plants that we want to grow that have to be disease resistant. One plant in particular we know is being grown at Mackinac were black currants. But if you know much about black currants, they can spread a disease called, I believe it's white pine blister, which is a disease that affects, of course, the white pine, and it bounces back and forth from them to the black currants. So in order to get those back at Michilimackinac, we had to get a permit and also get a disease-resistant variety. We also make some choices that we don't always see in the historic sources. Specifically, because we're limited on staff, we tend to use a heck of a lot of mulch in our gardens, and you don't see that in the 18th century. They think that any debris in the garden needs to be gone because it can harbor pests, and anything that moved in an 18th century garden was considered the enemy. Even earthworms and any of those sorts of insects, they preferred them not to be there. So mulch is one of those things that we kind of we make a little bit of a fudge there. But we do start also a lot of our seeds ahead of time because our tourist season is May till October. Here we can actually start planting the gardens usually by mid-April. We'll see how this year goes with cold season plants, and the warm season vegetables, things like cucumbers and squashes, we want to get those out as transplants because we'll get them before we close. The plants will mature before we close if we start them ahead. So we do that a little bit. And we also, I also tend to choose plants that are a bit more low maintenance. So maybe things that don't need to be babied. If you've ever grown melons, those plants need so much water, and sometimes we just don't have the time for it. So we're trying really to be really thoughtful about all of these things so that we can present the gardens in the best way that we can. And speaking about some of the plants, I am a total geek about heirloom varieties. I spend probably way too much time with seed catalogs and online looking at different varieties. If you're a gardener, I'm sure you do the same thing. We do use heirloom varieties wherever we can. Unfortunately, in our record, it's really hard to pin down the exact varieties that were being grown. There were seed companies by the 1770s that sometimes listed varieties, they sometimes didn't. One seed company might name a carrot one thing, and the exact same carrot will be called something else by the next seed company. So sometimes it can be really hard to pin down those exact varieties. The lettuce in this picture is one that we've been growing, I think for 3 or 4 years. It's called Sanguine Ameლიore, and it's beautiful. It's our little blood lettuce, and it does really well at Michilimackinac. So when we hit on something that will do well, sometimes we save the seed. We learn more and more about the plant every year. So the heirloom varieties that we grow, we source from other museums. I've had things given to me as well for the fort that are special to some of the people in the local area. But all of the plants that we grow, we try as hard as we can to choose varieties that are appropriate. Lots of root vegetables. And I like to call out our root vegetables because of our sand, they actually do pretty well. Our carrots rarely fork, for example. Our parsnips grow to head size. So root vegetables do great. Potatoes are really interesting because it's one of those vegetables people always ask us about, and they're kind of new in French Canada, but they are definitely growing them at Michilimackinac. John Askin was growing them, so kind of special. And of course, our onions, we grow all of the onions. And I'm sure I smell like onions half the summer as well. Um, whoops. We also do plant flowers. So when we're looking at those types of gardens, we talked about the indigenous, the French, and the British. Within those, they're often planting things just because they were pretty. And that can be quite shocking to think of folks on the frontier or people in the past growing things because they were beautiful. But there's this huge trend for growing things that are interesting and unique and new and colorful, especially in British gardens by the 1770s. If you've heard of people like Captain Cook, who traveled around the world, he took a botanist with him. That botanist was actually known by one of the people that came to Michilimackinac named Alexander Henry. So those connections are a lot smaller than we think, but people did like to grow flowers. They're also growing some herbs, not as many as you'd think. I don't actually find that much about herbs in the written record. I know we have a few things that have popped up in the archaeology, and it might just be something that people didn't write down. So, we do grow them here and there. This larkspur is one of my favorites. And kind of along with looking at those sources, we use a lot of gardening books from the time period. And I mentioned earlier, they like to kill things in the garden, anything that moves. They're essentially working in the 18th century garden as an organic gardener, not because they wanted to necessarily, but that's because that was the option. They're picking off pests by hand sometimes. You might see folks using slaked lime or wood ashes. Those are really your options for pest control. Tobacco juice I've seen being used, but the gardening techniques that we use as much as we can, we look to the historic record first. If what we're doing doesn't work, then we'll turn to the modern methods. But honestly, most of the 18th century techniques are really clever. On this list, I have hotbeds and cold frames. A hotbed is basically a pit that you dig. You fill it with manure, fresh horse manure if you can get it, and put dirt on top of it. And as the manure decomposes, it creates heat. And you can put a light or a window on top of that and create this bottom heated mini greenhouse. Very clever, very low technology. The cold frames are kind of like mini greenhouses. So building, again, maybe a pit, and then you put a window glass over the top to trap the heat. These small bell jars in this picture do the same thing. If you come to Michilimackinac, you will see these, and you can make them at home with just a milk jug in your garden. They do wonders. I can put plants out weeks earlier if I'm using these sorts of glass jars, or if you do it with a milk jug, it works again the same way. Our fertilizer is basically, we're using manure. Every fall we get truckloads of cow manure, but we're also using homegrown fertilizer that smells very badly. If anyone grows comfrey or can get your hands on some nettle and pack it in a big bucket and then pour water over the top and let it sit for a couple weeks, it smells awful, but it's really high in potassium. And so it helps the plants quite a lot during the growing season, get that extra boost, and it's free. And that's an 18th century technique. So if you've got some of those things around. And then probably our favorite thing that we do, our favorite 18th century gardening technique, is seed saving. We are pretty obsessive about saving seed because over time, if you save your own seed, you end up with plants that are better acclimated for your specific growing conditions, your soil, your climate. And seed saving allows you also to choose qualities that you want, and it's not complicated at all. I would be more than happy to talk to people more about that. We save our lettuce seed, that Sanguine Ameლიore. We got the original seed stock and we've been saving our own for the last 3 or 4 years. Our broad beans, we've been saving seed from them for 6 years, and it seems like every year they get better and better. So if you can save your own seed, I absolutely recommend it. And that's what a lot of 18th century gardeners would have been doing. Again, there were seed companies available, but sometimes they're not that reliable, and you don't know if things will get damaged when they get to Michilimackinac. And you also don't know exactly, when they're going to get here. It could be a year, and by then the seed might be bad because it does have a shelf life. So I really, really encourage folks to save their own seed. And I did list the first nursery because I thought that folks would enjoy that. The first place that's kind of providing commercially available plants started in 1730. So if you think about that, that's a long time ago. But they were important. People loved to buy plants even that early on. So we do some experimentation. I talk about seed saving, and we've had some interesting crosses, some on purpose, some not. But we do experiment with some of the historic methods. The row covers have been our latest experiment. I did not think this would work. I didn't know why, but I was very, very skeptical of the 18th century authors. But a row cover is just what it sounds like. Today, you can buy plastic row covers, but in the 18th century, it's simply a wooden frame with paper, and they would have been using probably linen paper. It's a wooden frame with paper glued to it, and then you paint the paper with linseed oil, and the darn thing will last a full summer. It'll last 6 months, long enough. Well, maybe not 6 months, not 6 months at the Straits of Mackinac, maybe 5 months out in the weather with the rain, the wind. These things are way sturdier than you'd think with just paper and glue and linseed oil. So that was a really successful experiment. And that's what you can see in this picture. I was painting on the linseed oil that day. We also do some companion planting. There are gardening book authors that, just like today, say that if you plant your onions with your lettuce will taste better. Or if you plant chives with strawberries, your strawberries will taste better. So I don't know exactly if the flavor is improved, but it doesn't seem to hurt anything, and they grow together well. So we do some companion planting. Our harvest times are also one of the things we experiment with, as well as planting times. You can plant way earlier here sometimes than we think. I've talked to local folks in Mackinac City, and they say, they plant Mother's Day weekend, or they wait until Memorial Day weekend. But I will start planting as soon as I can get the shovel in the ground, and I'll keep planting into August and September, because some plants like, of course, that cold weather, and they'll do just fine. There's also some interesting seed treatments that I've experimented with. Some of them are odd. One of the gardening books recommended that if you want your melons to be sweeter, you should carry them around. You should carry the seed around in your pocket for a month. It didn't work. But they sometimes also talk about soaking seed, which is something we still do today. Soot. Philip Miller talks about putting soot to keep the fly off. This last season, we had terrible trouble with flea beetles. I don't know if anyone else has experienced them, but flea beetles go after baby brassicas, and all of our turnips died. So this year, this will be my experiment, is to soot the heck out of all of our our baby turnips, and see if that helps. So every year we're trying something new. And this list, which if anyone's interested, I can share, most of these books are available online on Google Books, but just have a read. They're terribly interesting to look through if you're a gardener. Lots of sources out there online now. So we also have our challenges. I talked a little bit about the varieties. Finding the specific varieties can be troublesome. We have lots of folks coming in, so of course trying to manage our time taking care of the gardens. They are never weed free because we're chatting. Ideally, folks would help us weed while we're chatting, but that's not quite what folks want to do on vacation. But we do, of course, appreciate them coming to see us, so we can't complain. And also lots of research. It seems like there's never enough time to research and to read and to learn. But at Michilimackinac, I feel like there should be more resources popping up any day now. We do occasionally find things that we didn't know about, but when we can't find Michilimackinac specific sources, we start to look at places that are similar to Michilimackinac. So we might look at Detroit. What are they growing down in Detroit? We might look at Niagara, which is another place that's contemporary with Michilimackinac. We might take a closer look at what's happening over in Green Bay at the same time period. What does gardening look like over there? And a lot of the folks that were at Michilimackinac had come from other places. Most of them had come from other places. So what are the traditions in those places, and how would those translate to Michilimackinac? And recognizing some of those family connections. No single family has, well, most of them are bringing together different experiences. Even within my family, you've got one person from one state, one person from another state. How do they bring those things together at Michilimackinac? A lot of people at Mich and in the Great Lakes came from those sorts of mixed backgrounds. So recognizing that is interesting. We might not have a garden with only plants from England. Maybe there's some plants that are native to Michigan as well. So looking at those, we've had a lot of good things happening with our gardens. I think gardening is one thing that people do not expect when they come to a historic fort. You think of cannons and soldiers and muskets and those sorts of things, but we've had a lot of interesting feedback from people that have come to the fort and seen the work that we're doing with them. We consider our gardens to be exterior exhibits. So we want folks to be able to learn from them, and people get really excited about it. They often see things that they're familiar with, or if they're from a different country, they get excited to see that we're growing things that they recognize. It also has significantly reduced our bill for our food programs. We, in a normal year, cook 1 or 2 meals every day to show visitors what the food culture was like in the past. And we go through a lot of food. We no longer, however, ever have to buy any greens. We never have to buy any onions. We grow all of our own cabbages. This cabbage in the picture was grown at Michilimackinac. We were able to make it into sauerkraut and interpret vitamin C. And it's just a really good way to use the site as a whole to bring that into the interpretation. We do buy the things that they would have bought in the 18th century. So cheese coming from Europe in some instances, peas, spices, tea. They're getting chocolate into Michilimackinac. So we do buy those things, but we are able to supplement it with a lot of the food that we grow right on site. And that's really special, I think, for visitors to see. They can help us pick whatever we're cooking that day in a normal year. And it, again, kind of to wrap that up, it does connect people in a really unexpected way. So we are really happy with how we've been going. However, we want to think ahead. So we're going to keep trying new things. We are experimenting with one of those other 18th century gardening methods to dry onions or to store onions. We've made an onion rack that we unfortunately didn't get to use this last year, but we'll use next year. We'll be doing loads more research. I know I've got a whole list of things that we need to keep looking into. We haven't looked much into medicines, and I know that sometimes goes along with herbs. We do know that they're able to purchase medicine. So Turlington's Balsam of Life was one well-documented medicine at Michilimackinac, but it is possible that they're also using plants. So we're going to look into that a little bit more. They're doing a lot with plants, and I think that we've got a long way to go with our research. Outside of the Palisade, there were also 100 houses. So inside the wall, there were about 40. Outside the wall, there were about 100. So twice as big as what we're interpreting now. And what does that look like? And we've got plans to expand in some instances, but we'll be thinking about that in the future. And again, still looking for some of those specific plants. But I really love our gardens, and most of the summer I am elbow to fingertip covered in dirt and moving things around, and I love the smell and the sound of being out in the gardens. And I also really love that I can share our local history with people. And what I really want folks to know when they come to the fort and talk to me about gardens is that as much as I love them, in the past, no one at Michilimackinac was ever self-sufficient. No one was ever relying on them for all of their food or all of their medicines. They weren't dyeing things at Michilimackinac, so they weren't using plants for that. They were using them to supplement all those things that were getting shipped in, and they were using them to stay healthy. The fresh things that we're eating help keep us healthy. So they were here, they were important, but they weren't the only way of getting food and of supporting themselves. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview. I can talk for quite a long time, and I know some folks might have some questions, so I will let Beth manage that. She can read them to me, I think.
Yes, that is how I would like to do things. Thank you so much, Leanne. That was extremely interesting, and that's a whole side of interpretation and living history that you don't think about much, but there's just huge possibilities for sharing more about and learning more about the way people lived based on their gardens. And we do have a couple of questions. The first question is actually from Craig, and he's asking if you're looking for gardening volunteers.
Oh, am I looking for volunteers? I mean, okay, here's the thing with volunteering in a garden. I feel like already need to have some experience because I can be kind of bossy. And at Michilimackinac, we're dealing with hot weather and cold weather, and it's really uncomfortable sometimes. So I always like, whenever people ask about volunteering, I like to give them that little introduction. But yes, if anybody is interested in coming up and helping or learning, I have specific projects that I can set people to. I also sometimes just really don't mind the company, honestly. If you're interested in seed saving or interested in even some of the planting that we do, it's yes, email me.
And
Yeah.
if you are interested in volunteering and you would like Leanne's email, please contact me and I'll be happy to forward your contact information on to her. So just let me know. A couple more questions we have. Let's see. This one you sort of already answered, but it's sort of a two-part question. What do you do with the produce that you grow? And then also, do you sell any of the seeds from your produce?
Oh, heavens. Yes. So the things that we grow, we use on site as much as we can. We grow more than we can use. So I do give a lot away. When people come in, if we're chatting and they're terribly interested in carrots, I might send them home with a bag of carrots. It's better in their tummy than in the ground, I always think. We don't sell our seeds, but if you contact me and I have them, I'm always happy to share. I know we are planning on doing a seed giveaway at the end of the month through our Facebook page. But again, if you're interested, contact Beth. She can get you in touch with me. We really just like to share. I've got a lot, and we are not going to use it all. So
Catherine would like to know if you have any problems with deer eating your crops.
we don't. We have an 18-foot tall fence around the fort. Our biggest problem is ground squirrels. If anyone has experienced those, there's not really a good way to deal with them besides trap them, or I mean, that's probably the best way to get rid of them. The fence keeps out most of the rabbits. Sometimes we'll get rabbits inside, but it's very rare, and they're pretty easy to get out. I find that my coworkers are sometimes the worst pests. They get in the cucumbers before I can. But no deer. I've heard of a lot of ways to deal with that. If anyone has any other ideas, I'm sure you'd share. But with the ground squirrels, I've had a lot of luck spraying things with Tabasco.
That's good. Got it.
Yeah.
Let's see. This question is from Ben. He wonders if you, on the gardening boxes, or if you use gardening boxes, is there anything you treat the wood with, and wondering if that would harm the plants, or if there's any special ways that you fertilize the soil?
Yeah, I didn't talk about the raised beds. Raised beds were definitely a thing in the 18th century. They're a thing in the 16th century. Those first gardening books that are published, they talk about growing gardens by boards, which is a raised bed. The ones that we use raised beds in our commanding officer's garden, which is the garden with the purple flowers on this picture. And the wood is treated, so I'm a little bit more hesitant to eat things out of this garden. Um, but yeah, I don't know what they were from the lumber mill. Our park operations crew put those together, so I don't know exactly. They've been there for 5 years, 6 years, and they seem fine. So I guess depends on how often you want to rebuild them. And when we put manure on our gardens, we usually shovel it in the fall and just top dress everything. I sometimes will dig it in the spring, but usually by the time spring rolls around, the manure is decomposed and it's beautiful. You can see in one of these images as well, the straw that we use in between the rows, that also decomposes and adds some nutrients to the soil. You can overload it with straw, so we try to balance that out, but it will decompose over time and add a little bit to the soil. And when we use the liquid fertilizers, that gross stinky stuff that I mentioned, I always dilute that with water. It's usually about a cup of the gross stinky stuff to a gallon of water.
And
So, and then use water.
how did you make that again? It was nettles.
Yeah, nettles, you pack them in a bucket and pour water over the top and let it sit for a couple weeks till it gets black and slimy.
Um, let's see here. We do have another question. This they're asking if you plant any kind of cover crops in the off season.
Oh yeah, we have not experimented a lot with cover crops. I do know that John Askin was planting buckwheat in the late season. which would be used as a cover crop. And some of the other gardening books recommend cover crops for the winter that can be either opened up to farm animals when you want them cleared away or just left to die over the year. Um, our gardens are, we've got a lot of them, but most of them are small. And so the amount that of space that we have is not, I guess, really easy for planting a cover crop, but it's definitely something that I've considered and probably will do in the future. So.
And just one more question it looks like we have. They're asking about the chicken and wondering if the chicken is an heirloom chicken as well that we saw in the picture.
Our chicken, I think someone else owns chickens. Um, our chickens that we currently have are barred rocks, which it's an old breed, but it doesn't quite date to the time period that we are aiming for. I did want to buy Dominique chickens, which essentially look like barred rocks, but they have the rose comb instead of the single comb. But the hatchery sent us the wrong chicks. So we had intended to get Dominiques, but we got barred rocks. In any case, they're delightful little birds, and we've had poultry for a while now, and it's a really good addition. We feed them a lot of the garden junk, and they recycle it into eggs for us, and then we can use those eggs in our cooking programs, just like we use the vegetables. This winter, we kept our chickens in the fort. We usually send them to a farm for the winter, but we kept them in the fort, and they are already laying again. And we had a chick last fall that's still alive. So we are actually +1 chicken after this winter, which I would call a win. But they also will pick bugs and they'll dig around the plants quite a bit. So they're really useful if you've got a garden and can have chickens. They're really handy. They work hard.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions, so we are going to wrap it up there. Thank you again, Leanne, so much for joining us. And thank you everyone for participating and joining us for this virtual history talk. We hope to see you at our next one, which again is April 15th, and you can find out more information about that on our website. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.